Welcome to the course Evolution of the Earth and Life. Today we are going to talk about one specific mass extinction that took place 66 million years ago. So, the timeline that we are going to talk about is this boundary between Mesozoic and Cenozoic era. This can also be called the boundary between Cretaceous and Tertiary. Now, when we divide the age Tertiary, the first part is called Paleocene, and if we divide it into two parts, then it is called Paleogene and Neogene. Now, because of this, often the Cretaceous and Paleogene boundary is called KPG boundary. So, there are two versions that we will often come across in different records. One is called KT to indicate Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, and the other one is KPG indicating Cretaceous and Paleogene boundary. Both of them are technically the same, but today's nomenclature favors this KPG boundary name, and hence in the rest of the lecture we are going to use this KPG nomenclature. So, as we know that the diversity of organisms changed over time. If we look at the Phanerozoic diversity starting from Cambrian, that is 542 million years ago, it has gone up and down, but overall the pattern shows an increase, especially since last 200 years. But these changes or this increase is not a monotonic increase. That means that if we take any two subsequent points on this diversity curve, we cannot really say that the curve or that the point which is younger will show you high diversity. So, let us take an example that if we look at this point and this point, it is true that the older points has lower diversity than the younger points, but then there are points which are like this, where the older points have high diversity compared to younger points. These are the situation where it is not really an increase in diversity with younging age, and these are the situations what we are calling an extinction. So, extinctions are patterns where groups get wiped out and none of the representative individuals stay back. So, it is something like the death of a species rather than death of an individual. And we know that there are two kinds of extinction. One is a background extinction and the other one is a mass extinction. And if we look at this diversity curve, we will see that there are 5 yellow points, and all of these yellow points are indicating a major drop in the diversity pattern and therefore indicating a major extinction event. We are going to focus on this particular extinction event, which is between Cretaceous and Paleogene and therefore called KPG. Now, why are we studying this one particularly and not any other mass extinction event? The primary reason for that is our understanding of this KPG boundary mass extinction is relatively better compared to the other mass extinctions which are far back in the geologic time scale, and hence their records are not the best. This is the youngest of the mass extinction and their records are much more complete, and therefore it is easier for us to understand how it worked over time. So, let us now try to understand which were the group which got wiped out at this particular boundary. And what we see that there are many groups which we are familiar with actually got wiped out in this boundary. So, as we are looking at this particular plot, the time is going towards younger age as we are going up, and this particular line corresponds to KPG. The part above is the PG and the part below is the K. Now, let us see what are the groups that were there before, and if we start, the most prominent one that we can see is a dinosaur, and these dinosaurs got extinct across this boundary, and we are specifically talking about non-avian dinosaur. These non-avian dinosaurs are those dinosaurs which are not bird-like or not flying, and therefore, they are called non-avian dinosaur. These non-avian dinosaurs are very well represented during the Cretaceous and before, but the moment we crossed the KPG boundary, we do not find a single representation of this non-avian dinosaur. There are other vertebrate groups also which went extinct around this boundary. Another such thing is the great giant swimming reptiles. During Mesozoic, there were multiple types of swimming reptiles, and many of them were very, very large. All of them went extinct at this boundary, and after this boundary we do not have a single marine swimming reptile which is large. Apart from these, we also have certain types of fishes which we do not see very well beyond this point. Now, let us focus on other groups, non-vertebrate groups. So, among non-vertebrate groups, we know that there are different types of organisms living in the ocean. Many of them have hard skeletons. Among those organisms, one organism was very abundant throughout Mesozoic, and they are called ammonoids. These ammonoids were coiled organisms. They were mollusks, and they were very closely related to squids and nautilus, but these ones were coiled unlike the squid and octopus that we see today. So, squid and octopus, they represent a group called cephalopoda, and these ammonoids are also cephalopods, but these ammonoids were really large. They had a variety of groups, and they also had a very hard skeleton, and we really do not see any of them beyond this boundary. Whereas, if we go to Mesozoic, throughout Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous, the sea was full of ammonoids. The other groups that we see declining and some of them getting extinct are different types of mollusks. So, one particular type of mollusk are these rudist bivalves. Again, they look very different. They are very closely related to clams and scallops and oysters, but they looked different because instead of a typical clam-like shape, they looked more like a tube, and they had the top part of it as one lid or one valve, and the rest of the tube-like appearance is the other valve, and they were very good at making hard structures, creating reef. So, unlike the corals where we see the coral reefs today, these were one of the prominent reef builders during these Cretaceous times. These group also went extinct right around this boundary. We do not find a single rudist bivalve beyond this boundary. Now, let us focus on the plants. Now, among plants we see a completely different pattern. We find that the gymnosperms were very dominant around this time, and we found many of them going extinct around this time. So, therefore, the seeded plants, many of these seeded plants went extinct around this time. They were not completely extinct, therefore, they continued beyond this point, but at a very low abundance. On the other hand, the flowering plants, they were not, they appeared only in late Cretaceous, and they were not that abundant during this time, but after this extinction we find that them they are basically radiating or increasing their diversity at a very high rate. So, there are things which are quite abundant and they went extinct. There are others which were not that abundant, they survived and then they started proliferating. One more important thing to remember is this is also a time where there were mammals. Those mammals were very small, but they did not go extinct and they continued beyond this point. So, this is an example of the ammonoid that I was talking about, and all of them went extinct beyond this boundary, and you can see the coiled shape of this particular ammonite. The other group that I talked about was this marine reptile. We do not really see such marine reptiles, swimming marine reptiles which are giants any longer in the ocean. So, often people have thought about this point, that what makes a group go extinct? Is it a gradual process? But as we know that mass extinctions often show a very abrupt nature. What it means that it looked as if the groups were doing fine only for a specific time, beyond which it went extinct without any gradual decline in their diversity. And we want to see whether KPG extinction also shows some of these things. So, now if we look at these dinosaur group, the large group of Dinosauria, what we see that many of these started with a narrow branch during early Jurassic, but then they started becoming really wide, and these widening means it is a higher number of species or genera depending on which level we are counting. When we come to end of Cretaceous, majority of these lines or these groups are showing the maximum width, which actually tells you that they were doing just fine, and that does not really tell you that there was any gradual decline which led to the extinction. For example, this one, it actually shows a gradual decline, but it went extinct long before the KPG boundary. If you look at this particular one, it started radiating, it actually reached maximum of its diversity and then it went extinct. The only group which also showed very high diversity and continued are the birds, which we know are actually a part of the overall Dinosauria group. Now, if we specifically look at the dinosaur groups and look at how they were changing over time on very specific data, what we will see that if you look at these ages, so this is the KPG boundary that we are talking about. And we are coming from older age. Then if we combine the number of genera for non-avian dinosaurs, the total number is actually increasing over time. So, it is not showing any decline. If it were a decline, you would have expected a trend which is like this, but instead what we are finding is an increasing trend in the number of genera that we have. And that shows that this particular group was not showing any gradual decline before it went extinct. This is another very important clue about what might have happened during KPG boundary. And looking at all these patterns, people started thinking that this might have been a very abrupt event, because of which we do not see any gradual decline. Now, what caused the KPG extinction was a debate for a very long time. People observed this abrupt change or abrupt extinction quite a long time ago, but what might have caused it was not clear for a very long time, till a group of researchers started looking for a different thing and stumbled upon some interesting patterns. So, this picture shows a father and son group. The father was Luis Alvarez, who was a physicist, and the son was Walter Alvarez, who was a geologist. They wanted to understand little bit about a particular element called iridium, and their interest was to address some other question, because of which they wanted to check the iridium concentration across the KPG boundary. In order to do that, they went to a place called Gubbio. It is located in Italy, where you can find these rock layers, and the rock layers below this dashed line represents Cretaceous time, and the layer above the dashed line represents the Paleogene time. Now, what is this element iridium? So, this iridium, it is an element, and we do not really find it in high concentration on Earth's crust. We only find high concentration of iridium in asteroids, comets, and things in the outside, in things which are outside the Earth. So, in extraterrestrial material, iridium often shows up in high concentration. There are some iridium which can be deep inside the Earth, but it does not really come to the surface, and therefore, the overall surfacial concentration of iridium on the Earth is very low. Now, when they were measuring iridium across this boundary, they found an interesting pattern. So, what they were doing, they were collecting rock material from all of these points and analyzing their iridium concentration, and when they did that, they basically found that as long as they are not looking at this particular point, the iridium concentration is fairly low. But then if we concentrate on this particular point, which is the boundary, and here we find a really high concentration of iridium, it almost looks like this iridium concentration shot up very highly and then gradually declined. So, in order to present the entire thing in one plot, this above part and the part below has been represented in log scale, so that it is collapsed and it requires less space. The same in here, but this part, because it is small yet we need to see the detailed measurements, this has been plotted in linear scale, and this is the concentration of iridium which shows parts per billion, because generally the concentration is very low. Now, once they observed that the iridium concentration is very high and it corresponds to this KPG boundary layer, they tried to explain why this could be the case. One explanation is somehow the concentration of iridium from the entire Earth concentrated into this particular place. So, even though there are smaller concentration all over the Earth, for some reason all of them concentrated in one place and thereby increasing the overall concentration. But if that is the case, then if we do the same measurements globally, we should find a lack of iridium concentration globally. Only this part has a high concentration. That is one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is, if we find that globally the iridium concentration for this particular time is always high and surrounding rocks show lower concentration in time, that means extra iridium has been put on the earth's surface at that particular time. So, that would become hypothesis 2. So, their next step was to measure iridium from all over the world corresponding to this KPG boundary. When that was done, it was found that the global concentration was actually very high right at this boundary. It does not matter from where things were collected. So, the iridium concentration started showing very high level right at that KPG boundary all over the globe. So, we cannot really explain the iridium concentration by hypothesis 1, and therefore, the remaining hypothesis is hypothesis 2, which means that you are adding extra iridium to the earth's surface during this KPG boundary. Now, the question is, what can increase iridium concentration? What can bring extra iridium on the earth's surface? And one idea was that it can be an asteroid. So, meteors are these stony or iron stony substances which are in the extraterrestrial realm, and once in a while you also find them coming close to the earth, often attracted due to gravity, but when they go through the atmosphere, generally they burn, and only a very small piece finally end up on the earth's surface. There can be other situations where these meteorites are really large. They are so large that it cannot be burnt down through the atmosphere, and eventually a significantly large piece of rock hits the earth. In human time scale, it has not happened to the extent of very large substance hitting the earth, but these are what we call asteroid, and in Earth's history there were number of events which were caused by such large asteroid impacts. Now, these kind of asteroids could bring excess iridium on the surface of the earth, and that can lead to this increase in iridium for a specific time, and that is called iridium anomaly. So, Louis and Walter Alvarez proposed that it corresponds to this kind of a situation in KPG boundary. So, they were proposing that there was an asteroid which came to the earth's surface, hit the earth's surface, and thereby contributing a significant portion of iridium and added it to the overall surface. Now, if such a thing happens, then we are talking about a really high impact. Do we have any other evidence of such an impact? And as it turns out, there are separate evidences which also support this hypothesis that there was an impact. One such thing is called microspherules. These microspherules are very small particles. Sometimes they are completely spherical, sometimes they are a bit irregular shaped, they can be teardrop shaped. All of them form because of very high impact. Sometimes it is also found in nuclear testing sites because of the extreme heat in a relatively short amount of time. Because of the blast, when the sediments go up in the atmosphere, they are still hot, and finally they crystallize within a very short amount of time. creating these kind of microspherules, and if they are slightly larger, when they drop down they take this shape of a teardrop, and therefore, you can get a variety of shapes. So, they are either the circular ones, spherical ones are called microspherules. Sometimes you also get things which are called tektites. These are very common in these kind of impact sites. We can create them in nuclear sites today during nuclear testing. They basically represent these droplets which are created by the shock and blasted in the atmosphere, then quickly cooling down. Interestingly, many of these KPG sites contain a large number of these microspherules. Often they are also these tektite shaped. So, this supports the idea of an impact and a shock. This is not just one evidence. Another evidence comes from a mineral grain, and the mineral name is quartz. So, quartz, if we make a thin section of this quartz and look at it under microscope, it looks something like this. It is fairly white to greyish, colorless in appearance, and unless the section is very thick and therefore, it is showing some abnormality, it is not going to show any significant color. The other important point is, if you look at this structure of the quartz, you are not going to see any very specific orientation, what we call cleavage. Now, the quartz that has been discovered from some of these places associated with KPG boundary, they show these interesting color patterns, and you also see some of these striations. And again, our understanding comes from these nuclear sites, which subject the sediments around to a very high degree of shock metamorphism, and resultingly we find quartz grains which show colors. So, it changes their optical property, it shows colors as well as things like weak planes aligned in a particular direction or cleavages. Now, this again we started finding the shocked quartz, started finding from KPG boundaries. So, this also supports the idea that there was an impact. So, according to Alvarez, Louis and Walter Alvarez, the Earth was hit by a large asteroid 65 million years ago. That was their original idea. Now, the ages have been revised, and we know that it could range between 65 to 66 million years ago. But around that time, the Earth was hit by a large asteroid, and because of this asteroid impact, there were some direct effects that changed the atmosphere, and indirect effects which are relatively long term effect, which also impacted the atmosphere. And a combination of these things led to the wide scale collapse of the ecosystem and caused the extinction. So, this was the hypothesis that the Alvarez put out. However, one major issue was that although this was a hypothesis which explained the extinction of various groups, and there were supports of this impact in the form of shocked quartz and microspherules as well as iridium anomaly, it was still not clear that exactly where it hit, and do we find a crater for these kind of impact. So, in summary, today we learned about one of the major mass extinctions, the youngest one, which is called a Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction. This Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction or KPG extinction caused the extinction of a number of groups. Among vertebrates, it includes non-avian dinosaurs, large marine reptiles, Among the invertebrate groups, it wiped out ammonoids, rudist bivalves, many other microorganisms which can secrete their shells. Among plants, it also changed because it did not impact the flowering plants. On the other hand, the total number of seeded plants started to reduce because of this extinction. Now, the reason for this extinction was proposed by Louis and Walter Alvarez, where they found an interesting iridium anomaly during this KPG boundary, which was global in nature, and then they interpreted it to be a result of an asteroid impact. The asteroid impact was also supported by findings of microspherules from the KPG sites as well as the shocked quartz. Both of these things are often produced in nuclear sites, and using all these supports, the Alvarez proposed this impact hypothesis, which argues that there was a large asteroid which impacted the Earth 66 million years ago and changed a global change in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean, which finally led to the extinction of these diverse groups, which were often at the height of their diversity. These are some of the resources that I used for this slides, and here is a question for you to think about. Thank you.